guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my friend JD Greear, or for those who cannot see this, which is probably everybody, even those watching on video, he's joined the studio as JD the Magnificent. So it's hard to give a bio for a man who describes himself that way, but you won't be surprised to hear that he's in fact a mega church pastor based in North Carolina. You might be surprised to hear that he's actually also a great guy. JD, thank you for joining me.
Fair. Well, I appreciate that. And I did not know that your viewers might be able to see JD the Magnificent. That was only for you, Rebecca.
I don't think they can, but I thought they needed to participate and know it, even if they couldn't. So JD, you have written a number of books alongside pastoring your little church down there in North Carolina. And the one that you've written most recently is one that I was delighted to endorse, because a lot of things you were saying in that book are things that are very much at the center of my heart as well. And I'm excited for our listeners to hear a bit more about it. It's called Everyday Revolutionaries, which is a lovely provocative title, How to Transcend the Culture War and Transform the World. Why did you feel the need to write this book in the first place?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things. I'll answer on two fronts. One is, I think you're seeing right now the message of Jesus being reduced to a political platform, at least in the United States, where it's made synonymous with, one side of the political aisle. And I want to be very clear. There are certain things that, Christians have to be very clear about that the Bible teaches. And sometimes those things are, they sound like partisan issues. And the fact that they sound like partisan issues doesn't mean that we should not speak with clarity about them. I mean, John the Baptist, who is Jesus's cousin, confronted Herod for a sexual sin that was socially accepted in his day and literally lost his head because of it. And, Jesus didn't say, "Oh, John, you were meddling in political affairs and, you should have just stuck to the love of God message." He called John the greatest prophet ever to live. And so, there's a sense in which Christians have to have the boldness that does confront our society's idols, whatever they are, whatever side of the aisle they apply to, and whatever political fallout there is from that. But having said that, what I try to say in the book is that faithfulness to Jesus is not less than clarity about controversial issues. It's just a lot more.
Right.
Jesus was the way John described him was that he was full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. It wasn't like he was half full of each, or he had a little, switch that he toggled into grace mode. Now he's in truth mode. He was full of both of them. And, there's grace without truth. That's kind of a sentimental, mushy, let's just call it liberalism. I'm not trying to use labels here, but, just kind of a lack of core belief. But then there's truth without grace. And that's a damning fundamentalism. And neither one of those are who Jesus is. He's someone who is filled with both of them. In fact, John leads with grace before truth in his description, which in Greek is a way of saying that's what Jesus led with. What you knew when you were around him, what you had a sense of was, he spoke hard truths, but he cared about you. He drew you close. Our world says that really there's only two ways to treat these issues. There's affirmation or there's alienation. And what Jesus shows was a different way, which was something that was filled with grace and truth. So that's one reason. The second reason, I'll just say really quickly, is that a lot of Christians don't know what to actually do in the midst of this kind of polarized culture. Is it to, put signs up in your yard and, plaster your Facebook wall or your Instagram reel with all kinds of, bold political statements? I mean, again, it's not less than clarity about controversial issues, but the Bible lays out a way that the Apostle Paul calls living quietly. And I know that sounds odd coming from a guy who stood in an Ephesian amphitheater. And when I say Paul, by the way, I mean the Apostle Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. This is a guy that stood in an Ephesian amphitheater with an angry crowd yelling at him, and he tells them that the gods they're worshiping are not gods at all. So he's not like a mousy kind of leave me alone guy in the corner. But he says that the way that Christians ought to live is living quietly, in the sense that they so bless the neighbors around them and so enrich their lives and make them better that our neighbors could not imagine their lives without our presence. I often say this to our church here, Rebecca, that we want our community around us to say that We may not believe what those crazy people at Summit Church believe, but thank God they're here, because if not, we'd have to raise our taxes. That's Paul's living quietly. And so what I do is I try to unpack what are the actual practical steps of living that way that sets up for a loud testimony.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think one of the big questions that people have, probably both inside the church and outside the church, is how are Christians relating to those outside the church? And some people could have a variety of views about, what the best version of that is, and whether the Christians in their neighborhood or in their country are doing that. But I appreciated it in your book. One of the things you were giving just like a lot of concrete examples of is how to practically love your neighbor. And that's something for those less familiar with Jesus's teaching. It's one of the things that Jesus sort of puts first and foremost in terms of how we're to behave toward one another. And when he's asked, well, what does it mean to love who is my neighbor? Because, all of us, there's some neighbors we have a really easy time loving, right? The neighbors who agree with us, the neighbors who get on well with us, the neighbors who we're all on the same page politically, our kids go to the same schools, we all have the same, those neighbors, it's easy to love those neighbors. But Jesus actually tells us that we need to love the neighbors we were raised to hate. He famously gives this example of the Good Samaritan, which, for us, Samaritan equals good, because that's all we know about Samaritans, is that there's a good Samaritan, but actually...
And they got a purse, and they do good things.
Right, but for the people Jesus is first talking to, all they know about Samaritans is that they're bad. Right. So help us think, JD, about how, if we are followers of Jesus, how should we relate to those in our communities who may actually see us as the enemy or bad? And I think that's probably one of the big shifts that a lot of Christians in the US have gone through in the last sort of few decades, is moving from a place where people around them might not be Christians or might not show up to church themselves, but they sort of generally think well of Christians, to, in many parts of the US, kind of a culture where people think that Christians are actually the reason everything's gone wrong, like the source of all the bad stuff.
Well, let me actually kind of affirm the premise, and then I'll actually try to give the answer that you asked for in a really practical way. The premise is something that I've heard different people refer to as what they call the negative world for Christianity. And what that means, it's a rather simplistic idea, but the positive world is a world where Christianity is seen as a social asset, where, it's just part of the foundation, the bedrock. It's the principles we all agree on. The neutral world, which, some sociologists say, at least in the United States, started to really take place around the mid-1990s, was where Christianity became one option among many. It's not the only one, doesn't dominate the public square, but, it's just an option, my way, your way. The negative world, which they say started somewhere around 2014 in the United States with the Obergefell decision, which legalized gay marriage, Christianity went from being one option among many to it's actually part of the problem. It's the impediment to progress. It's keeping us from the society that we want to have, this, this better and more perfect union that we need. So what do Christians do in that kind of environment when they're seen as someone who's actually no longer helping the society? They're actually hurting. So I'm going to give a quick biblical example and then a really practical example. I use the story of Daniel in the Old Testament as kind of a foundation and he just kind of weaves his way through the book here. Because here you got Daniel, who is an Old Testament prophet, lived 500 BC, and he is in a place called Babylon, which was a pagan kingdom that took Israel captive and, destroyed the city and brought the people to live as slaves there in Babylon. And here you've got Daniel. He's in King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon. He's a slave in his palace. And Daniel is so bold in his declarations of truth. Not once or twice, but literally in every chapter, he's confronting somebody about something. So bold that, he makes them so mad that the king ends up throwing him in the lion's den. Everybody knows that story, Daniel in the lion's den. So bold that he ends up in the lion's den. And yet he is so beloved by the king whose decree put him in the lion's den that same king stays awake all night weeping outside the lion's den, hoping against hope that Daniel makes it through the night. And my question is, how do you become like that in our society? Because I feel like when you're really being faithful to God the way in our generation, the way Daniel was in his, that's the kind of effect you have in your society. You got both sides of it. There's a prophetic boldness that confronts, the church's sins, but also the culture's sin. We are salt and light, speaking truth to our culture, and yet so beloved by our community that they couldn't imagine Babylon, I put that in quotes, without us. I mean, I don't think the king was standing outside the lion's den because he just missed Daniel's prophetic rebukes. I think he did. I think he knew Daniel was genuinely his friend, and he couldn't imagine Babylon without Daniel. That's the biblical example. The practical example, and I'll just kind of put an exclamation point on this since you brought up Jesus in the question. What Jesus did with this is he scandalized people by the way that he ate his meals. Mm-hmm. One commentator said Jesus got crucified for who he ate with and the kind of meals he ate. Jesus eats his way through the Gospel of Luke because he's just constantly engaging people in fellowship ways. That's him leading with grace. Yes, he's speaking truth. And I'm sure there was a lot of him talking about what God wanted in situations, but he's doing so in the sense of bringing them close and fellowship. That's the grace before truth. So I think that a very practical thing that we can do is who's around your dinner table right now. Mm-hmm. Those neighbors that you have, the ones with the crazy signs in their yard, the ones who drive you crazy because of the flags they fly and the bumper stickers they put on their car. Are they sitting around your table as friends and as neighbors that you are bringing close? That's the way that we follow Jesus, live like Daniel, live like Jesus.
Yeah. So what would you say to somebody who said, well, all you're describing there, JD, is Christians coddling our culture? And if I invite somebody into my living room, or if I show warmth and friendliness to my neighbors who I know believe in, not only believe in, but sort of want to proclaim things that the Bible is against, aren't I just complicit in that?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is you fully accepted the world's lie at that point, because I said this earlier that the world says the only options when it comes to somebody who morally you might not agree with or religiously you don't agree with, the only things are affirmation or alienation. Jesus gave a different approach, and let's be clear, it angered people on the so-called religious right of his day. Right? I mean, we sometimes forget that Jesus's crucifixion was a joint project of both, I'll use modern terms, secular left and the religious right. The secular left hated him for what he said, truthfully. The right hated him for the people that he drew close. And I would say you don't have to accept that dichotomy. You can be like Jesus, and you can love and live in ways that are filled with both grace and truth, because only in doing so will you be like Jesus. Let me say one thing to those who may have had a Christian background growing up, listening. I grew up in a very, conservative Christian context. All my life, Rebecca, I was warned about the ditch on the left side of the Christian road. And that ditch was compromise, failing to speak truthfully and coddling the world, going along with them. Just to be clear, I believe that ditch is real. I believe it's an ever-present temptation for the church. But nobody ever warned me about the ditch on the right side of the road. It's like the old Scottish proverb. I'll say this for you. For every 1 mile of road, there's 2 miles of ditch. So you got to be aware that they're both there, and that Jesus ultimately ran afoul of both of them. And, but we got to stay where he is, in the middle of that gospel road.
Yeah. And I think it's something that actually will land differently for us depending on physically, kind of geographically where we live. And I think that's true of the different places you and I live within the United States. I'm up here in the wilds of the northeast of America in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the vast majority of people around me are going to be people who have some major barriers to considering the claims of Jesus because of some of the ways in which Christianity is sort of at odds with cultural consensus when it comes to gender and sexuality, for example, and when it comes to abortion. I think where you're located down in North Carolina, you've probably got a sort of double-layered thing going on where you've got a lot of people in the broader community around you who would actually be may not be followers of Jesus at all, but would be aligned with Christians on some of those questions because of kind of where they land politically. And then you've got also probably a bunch of people coming out of Duke and UNC and some of the research universities around you who sort of almost would double down on their differentiation from those folks around who are very aligned with the sort of political right. So forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing your community, but I think one of the really challenging things, and one of the ways in which Christians can sometimes be kind of talking past each other, is when we don't recognize the difference that our geographic situation makes as we think through these issues. So some people will say, for example, the ways in which Christianity, in a lot of people's perceptions, is strongly tied to the right in the US right now, is a major barrier to evangelism in my part of the world up here. Like, that's one of the big things that people are going to struggle with, and not really want to be associated with Christians because of that. In some other parts of the country, that's going to be a big win in terms of like reaching non-believers, is to say, oh, look, we're on the political same page on these various different kind of questions. And so I think it's easy for Christians in different like geographical places to really miss one another on that, and not recognize that there might be non-Christians who live around them who things are going to land on very differently, and then are going to kind of judge each other for saying, oh, you're just compromising with the left because you're trying to reach your neighbors who lean left. And whereas I'm sitting up here and just saying to people, oh, you're just compromising with the right by trying to reach your neighbors who lean right. And I think it's really helpful, as you pointed out, like if you actually open your Bible, you will find significant critiques of both the current political options in the US, and everybody's going to have to kind of figure out in conscience and with the Bible open kind of how they're going to negotiate that when it comes to sort of election season. But you're going to find some major challenges ethically on both sides. But even as you think about how to talk to your neighbors about Jesus, you're going to find them in different starting points. Is that fair to say? We're kind of living in different Babylons.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have the unique privilege of living in what is purple in every possible way, in the blue and the red coming together, which for your listeners outside the United States, red in our country represents the Republican side and blue represents the Democratic side.
Which is funny because in the UK, it's the opposite.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think they deliberately chose red to go with Republicans so they didn't associate communism, the red of communism, with the Democratic Party. But so, I mean, because we're a red state, we've been red, we vote Republican in the last several elections, but they're deeply blue cities. In fact, the most offensive thing I will say in this podcast is about to come. You ready?
I'm ready.
Forbes magazine always says that Raleigh-Durham is the educational hub of America, which always ticks off the Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts crowd.
But carry on.
But you know what? I mean, what does Forbes know, right? But it's because of the quality of the places times the amount of students that are in the area. Yeah. More PhDs per capita than anywhere else in the United States. And a lot of those people are transplants. They come in, they're here for 4 to 8 years, and then they leave. So what that means is that I'm looking at a context. It's just very, it's just not homogenous. One of the problems that technology has brought us, which I'm overall net thankful for technology, but it used to be that when I was speaking, a pastor was speaking, you're speaking to a local church. Well, now, you got people that are listening to the sermons that are not in the context. And so it's hard because I want to contextualize this message for that audience. And so does the guy in Dallas, Texas. And so does the person speaking up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And you're like, yeah, if I were speaking to this other audience, I wouldn't change the truth, of course, but I may change the posture. I may change the presentation. That's just something that's very difficult. I think the thing to hold on to that I want to emphasize that you said is there are political ramifications of embracing the Christian worldview. And you can say that it critiques both sides. This is important without trying to draw some kind of moral equivalency. We're not always trying to balance the scale and say equally this, equally bad. But what we're saying is that political realignment of whatever kind is downstream from discipleship. It should not be the gateway to it. Right. And Jesus does that when he draws his disciples close. I mean, to use a rather famous example, Jesus's disciples, Matthew attaches labels to two of them. There's Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot, which shows you that if nothing else, they're divided on the most emotionally charged political issue of his day. Yeah. And, I imagine, Rebecca, they had some spicy conversations around the campfire. Jesus probably made them room together. You go by their tent late at night and their fingers in each other's face, arguing like a couple seminary students about Calvinism. Just some theological issue they're arguing about. But what it was is ultimately Jesus's kingdom teaching would transform both of their approaches. Some would say Simon's more than Matthew's. Simon believed that you ought to, the right response was to overthrow Rome as usurpers, and Matthew thought you should cooperate with Rome by collecting taxes for him. Both of them had, so-called biblical justification for their side. Jesus would ultimately transform both of them, but the point was he didn't make alignment around a particular political posture the gateway for coming into his band of disciples. And so I do that with Republicans and Democrats here. I want to teach the truth, but I don't want this to be the Republican church or the Democrat church, because ultimately Jesus calls from both parties to be his followers, and the gospel will transform both of them in different ways. But that's downstream from discipleship, not the gateway to it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. One of the great privileges of my weekly life is to host a community group up here, a sort of Bible study group where we meet together, we eat some food, we chit chat, we read the Bible, we pray, and we seek to love one another in sort of various ways throughout the week as well. And one of the things that I've been actually really encouraged by in recent weeks is seeing that within our group, and it's a very diverse group in terms of, geographically where people have come from, like all sorts of different countries and contexts, sort of socioeconomically where people have come from, some people who've been Christians all their lives, some people who literally just became a Christian like this past summer. And seeing an actual political diversity within the group, which I'm not sort of celebrating in and of itself just because isn't it lovely to have political diversity? It's actually hard to have political diversity. And it's not that people within the group don't agree on the things that the Bible is exceedingly clear about. But what they strongly disagree about is the sort of trade-offs. As we think about the different political options in the US at the moment, they sort of passionately disagree about which side taken as a whole, and when you've kind of calculated, you've factored all the different things in and all the things that Christians should rightly care about, they've landed in different places, and that means for some challenging conversations. But one of the things that I think is really helpful is for them to see, and something that it's helpful for me to see as well, because we all come in with our own understanding of the world, and it will be filtered through various pieces of our own history as well as our understanding of God's word. But to see where usually, especially in the online world, we kind of listen to our own people and we demonize everybody else. We're like, how could you be so stupid as to think that? Or how could you be so utterly morally bankrupt as to have made that decision or to have aligned in that way? And instead they're kind of having to look at each other's eyes and be like, right, so now I'm talking to somebody who is a brother and sister or sister in Christ who actually agree, we agree on the things the Bible's exceedingly clear on, but we've come to really different views on what this then, how this then plays out. And I've got to this is hard, I've got to live with you, I've got to talk to you, but it's sort of humanizing some things which more and more, especially in our online spaces, I think get kind of dehumanized or demonized where we only want to hear the absolute worst arguments for the other person's position. We have no interest in the genuinely good arguments that have led them to that conclusion, even if the conclusion is one we profoundly disagree with. I think it's we're never going to understand why other people believe what they do if we don't actually take the time to listen to their reasoning. And again, it's not because ultimately there is no truth or there's no kind of right or wrong in this situation and we just have different perspectives. No, there will be real right and wrong, but for me to understand and to have any chance of persuading somebody else to change their mind on an issue as well, I need to really listen, really understand where they're coming from and why.
One of the existential crises of our time period right now, Rebecca, is undoubtedly going to be how we grappled with the new advent of all this technology and the social media. It feels a little bit to me like, when cigarettes got invented, 75 years ago, everybody's like, this is amazing. You can just walk around smoking, and then like about 20 years, you're like, actually, this was a really net negative for everybody. And everybody's
this
got
is
cancer
killing
now.
us.
Yeah, it's just killing. And I feel like it's a little bit what's going on right now because, I mean, just take the recent horrific events with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You've got social media algorithms that are being tailored to people in the same church, so that half of my church, or more than half, are showing up, and all they've seen are these incredible, bold statements he's made that they agree with. And the other, part of the church, all they've seen are these really just offensive sounding things. And that literally, they have not seen anything from the other side. All they've seen is that, both of them are looking at the other one saying, how could you possibly, not feel the way that I feel about this issue? And you're like, well, it's because there's been a tailored diet that's been given to you. When it comes to these kinds of issues, I know I sound like Wendell Berry here, but you've got online world is not real community, because when I'm looking at the face of someone who I passionately disagree with their political calculus, like you put all these things in, pulled the lever, and came out with that candidate, I disagree with that. I can still strongly disagree with it, but when I'm looking in their eyes, I see somebody many times who shares my same convictions, love of the Bible, my belief in these absolute true things and this moral stuff. We can still disagree, but I can look at them and say, hey, I recognize this is a sister in Christ, a brother in Christ. And it doesn't mean we don't disagree. It just means that there's a humanized version of it that we experience in the church.
Yeah, and I think one of the complexities that we face, which is actually, I think ultimately, it was really helpful to me when I realized this, was that all of us across the West, so I'm including not only the US, but Europe, where I'm from, and Australia, which geographically isn't the West, but sort of somehow culturally is the West, right, thanks to colonization and whatnot, and that's a whole nother conversation. But across the West, at least, we're all working on the basis of certain moral parameters. So all of us, regardless of how we'd vote or how we'd think on certain political issues, if you knock on your neighbor's doors, they will agree with you that all human beings are fundamentally like equal in value. They'll agree that men and women are equal. They'll agree that the strong and the rich and powerful shouldn't be trampling on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, that disabled babies should be cared for, that love across racial difference is a good thing. Like these will be things that everybody agrees on, regardless of how they would identify religiously or how they would identify politically. And all of those things have actually come from Christianity. If you look at the history of ideas, and without Christianity, none of those things actually stand. I mean, it's all sort of wishful thinking, and this is something which listeners to this podcast may have heard me kind of go on about this again and again. But like, non-Christian historians will say this. So whether it's
Tom Holland, who is may or may not be a Christian, but he's
I mean, he's so not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, for those who are wondering, but the British historian Tom Holland, who at least when he wrote Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, was agnostic, and one of his things he discovered in the process of writing that was, oh gosh, all the moral beliefs that I think are just basic moral common sense are actually Christian. Like they didn't just spring out of the ground. They aren't like universal truths that everybody knows. They're Christian beliefs, and without Christianity, they don't stand up anymore. Right. You'll know Harari, the Israeli historian and philosopher, who I think identifies as atheist, or certainly doesn't believe in Christianity, and he will say things like human rights are figments of our fertile imaginations. Like he says that the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with universal human rights and equality. So as we enter into conversations, even ones where there'll be massive sort of disagreements about where people land, the kinds of the ethics to which people are appealing will boil down to justice and love and equality and all these Christian goods that can sometimes be leveraged in ways that are completely against what the Bible teaches. But we're fighting on Christian ground, even if we're even if we don't realize it. And I think that's part of why, as we look at the political world, Christians sort of end up landing in different places, because they hear an appeal for care for the poor, for example, or they hear an appeal for justice for the oppressed, and they think, yeah, that's a Christian thing, and it is. And sometimes, it's applied in ways that are aligned with the Bible, and sometimes it isn't, but they sort of have that deep sense of, oh yeah, this is calling me to something that Jesus clearly teaches, because it is. You're going to struggle to make an argument that doesn't somehow connect back to Christianity in the West, because we're so, like, our soil has been so sort of tilled with Christianity over the years. But then once we realize that, it can help us to sort of see how people have landed in different places without being necessarily, utterly morally bankrupt.
Right.
I think it also helps us to see the fundamental necessity of the truth claims of Jesus. Because at the end of the day, if Jesus isn't the Son of God, the way, the truth, and the life, and in fact he is a fraud or a crazy person making these bizarre claims about being God in the flesh, why would we follow his teachings? Like, why would any of, all this stuff about universal equality and loving even your enemies, like all of that, we can just let go of that. So it's sort of interesting, I think, when you get in the right way really deep into these conversations. And, I'll give the example of abortion. Like, if there is no God, and if Jesus isn't the Son of God who came to die for love of you and me, then the baby in a mother's womb is just a collection of atoms and molecules. Like, this is just fetal tissue, whatever dehumanizing language you want to use. It's true.
Right.
But if Jesus isn't the Son of God, then that's what the mother is as well. And so if you're coming into that conversation desperately wanting to advocate for the vulnerable mother, like, that's just a collection of atoms and molecules as well. Like, we actually need Jesus to be true, not just, a great moral teacher, but the Son of God, for any of this to hold.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got a little bandwagon there.
I love it.
JD, some avid listeners to the Confronting Christianity podcast, of whom maybe there are a few, will have heard my conversation with our mutual friend Molly Worthen. In fact, we had a couple of conversations, and I'd love for people to hear your sort of side of Molly's conversion, because I actually think this is a great example of exactly what you were describing in the book. Christians reaching out to those who don't agree with them and showing them a kind of love and taking their questions with a sort of kind of seriousness that might actually lead to them considering the claims of Jesus.
Yeah, Molly.
Your side of the story.
So Molly, for anybody that doesn't know, she's a superb journalist, written for the New York Times, written for a lot of our most reputable publications here in the United States. And she is a PhD from Yale University, professor at UNC Chapel Hill. And she asked if she could come do an article on our church, which I at first interpreted like somebody from the, Capitol coming down to the districts, in the Hunger Games to do an article on the zoo animals down here. But she is a superb journalist. She is, she really is always, for all of her professional life, sought to really understand people on their own terms. It's what's made her really good at what she is. And this was no different. But as we're doing this interview, one of my favorite definitions of evangelism, trying to reach people for Jesus, is it's like running a magnet over the sand. That's all you're doing. And then, because you're seeing where God is already at work, planting things in people's hearts. I just kept noticing that some of the questions she was asking me seemed to have less to do with Christianity as a socio-political movement and more to do with her own walk or her own struggle journey of faith. And I just stopped in the middle of the interview and I said, Molly, I feel like these questions are not about us. I feel like these are about you in some ways. And she kind of blanched a little bit, it wasn't like a huge dramatic moment, but she said, because I asked her about her own, and she says, I'm not sure when the last time somebody asked me about that was. She said, I've interviewed, hundreds of Christians over the years. And she says, just, somebody asked me about how I'm wrestling with these things. Well, that began a relationship that consisted of us going back and forth on email, me trying to help her distinguish the essential from the non-essential, which is a little bit to your point here. There are things that are downstream from the lordship of Jesus that you have to talk about in the right order. C.S. Lewis did this in Mere Christianity after one of the, most illuminating chapters in English on on sexuality and the difference between biblical sexuality and so-called pagan sexuality, C.S. Lewis said, hey, if this just, kind of freezes you in your tracks, let's just punt it for a little while. We'll come back to it. Let's talk about the lordship of Jesus, because the center of Christianity is the lordship of Jesus. And so it was me doing that with Molly, like, okay, yeah, that's a really good question. Problem of evil, all the different religions in the world, creation, evolution, what's going on with homosexuality. Those are all very important questions. I'm not saying they're irrelevant, but let's just punt them for a little while. Let's deal with whether the tomb is empty or not, and whether Jesus was who he says he was. And so, for several months, we did a deep dive on that. And that deep dive included, reading N.T. Wright's Resurrection of the Son of God, this amazing, incredible book I just could not get enough of, and she loved, called Confronting Christianity it's a Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin. We devoured that one. Then I got her set up to talk with the late Tim Keller, who was still on earth at that point. And to make a long story short, like a classic professor, she set kind of a due date for herself, like, I'm going to have this all figured out by this. And I was like, theologically, yeah, I'm not sure that works, Molly, but whatever, she, and so the day that she, it was St. Augustine's Day on the liturgical calendar. And she came in, she said, hey, she says, I'll be honest, I cannot say that I have zero doubts and that I'm absolutely 100% convinced. She said, but I know I'm more convinced than I'm not convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. And so she put her trust in Christ. She used a great example that has been so helpful to a lot of doubters in our own church, and to be honest, even me. One of the guys that C.S. Lewis brought to faith in Christ was a guy named Sheldon Van Auken. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he wrote a book called A Severe Mercy. And in that, he uses this example that Molly said described her own spiritual journey. Sheldon Van Auken says, we always talk about the leap of faith to Jesus. So you imagine that, Jesus is a cliff and you got to leap to it, and it's scary. He said, but what no one ever talked about was the fact that my own cliff that I was standing on was not solid.
Right.
And I could see it crumbling beneath my feet. Yeah. And what's more risky, to stay here or to jump there? And he said, part of the motivation for the leap of faith is Jesus was solid, and this mountain I was standing on was not. Molly felt the same way. I think you're seeing that right now, Rebecca, with Gen Z. This Gen Z returning to church, and some of that is a political expression. But whatever you're seeing that they have found social or progressive, that secular progressivism, and let's just call it so-called woke ideology. They've seen that is a crumbling foundation you cannot build a life on, and so they're looking to leap to something. And that's what Molly did, and that something was solid, and it was the resurrection of Jesus, which I would say to all of your listeners, leap for that, because you'll find it's the most solid thing in the universe is the empty tomb of Jesus and the lordship of Christ.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and to build on Molly's illustration there, the ground under your feet, if you're not a follower of Jesus and you actually look at the ground under your feet on some of the questions that we've already discussed, you'll find that it doesn't support your deepest beliefs. You will find, for example, you mentioned questions of sexuality, and there are obvious ways in which, from many people's perspective, Christian sexual ethics of saying like sex only in male-female marriage sounds like not only weird, but like offensive. So let's imagine a world without Christianity, and we can do that by looking back at the world sort of prior to Christianity. One of the things you'll notice is that Christianity introduced the idea of sexual consent. This is an argument not made by me, but Kyle Harp, who's not a Christian himself, but a historian, wrote a book called From Shame to Sin about how Christianity changed how sex was seen in the Greco-Roman Empire. And one of the points he makes is that prior to Christianity, there wasn't a concept of sexual consent, at least for a significant proportion of people. So if you were a slave or a prostitute, like nobody was asking if you were consenting to your master having his way with you. This just wasn't even, no more would I ask the consent of a chair before I sit on it. Like that was kind of the framework. And Christianity comes along and says, no. Sex only in male-female marriage, and everybody counts. There is no, well, yeah, but never mind if you're sleeping with a prostitute, or never mind if you're sleeping with a slave, because in fact, deep in Christian ethics is that every human being, however however young, however old, however poor, however rich, actually matters. And so their sexual integrity matters as well. And so even if we look at the one ethical foundation that pretty much everybody across the rest is going to agree on, regardless of what else they think, that sex without consent is wrong. Like the rape is morally wrong.
Can I give a couple cool details on that? I'm actually I pulled up a little section from my book, Everyday Revolutionary. The first century Roman Emperor Claudius commissioned a statue to commemorate his conquest of Britain, depicting himself, muscular and mighty, raping a young British slave girl. The statue was his boast, his pride. Yeah. We now find that horribly offensive. Why do we now have laws protecting the vulnerable from sexual exploitation when they celebrate it? In other words, why is Harvey Weinstein today deemed a criminal while Claudius, who was guilty of the same things, faded with a marble statue? And the reason, Tom Holland says, that is the difference in those two was the introduction of the Christian sexual ethic, that it was the foundation for things that we now just take as axiomatic. Yeah. The fact that the strong should not exploit the weak, the fact that, there ought to be a social safety net, universal human rights, protection, limitation of power, all that stuff comes from the application of the Christian worldview, so that even our atheists in American society and British society, even our atheists are Christian atheists. And who recognizes that now, and it's crazy to hear him talk about it, is Richard Dawkins. I've heard him recently talking about like his appreciation for. I'm like, it's a bizarro world, but he's recognized there is no foundation without these things that Christianity taught.
Yeah. And he said in his book for teens that moral consensus changes like with the wind. Like, if you're basing it on, well, everybody around me believes this, well, good luck, because you could go back to periods in history when everybody around you believed all sorts of things that you would think are fundamentally morally evil. Right. And how would you have known? Like, if there's no actual lawgiver, which for Christians isn't just a sort of moral law descending from the skies, but in fact a person, the person of Jesus Christ, who both taught and lived this extraordinary ethical, extraordinary and beautiful ethical understanding of how humans should relate to one another. I think all the ways in which, and I think this is true for non-Christians, both on the right and the left, all the things that they are longing for, all the deepest aspirations of our hearts, and all the things that in our wildest dreams we hope that a world will become like this, are ones that actually Christianity originated and ultimately will deliver when Jesus comes back. And at the center of this whole system is this incredible picture of a man who claimed to be the Son of God himself, like the most powerful human being in all of history, dying the most horrifying and excruciating and humiliating death for love. So if you're somebody who is looking for love, Christianity is the place to go. Even as we think about Christian sexual ethics, it's not just sex only and male-female marriage, but according to the Bible, it's all about Jesus' love for us. Like, it's actually all about a metaphor, right, a picture of a husband and wife are meant to kind of look like Jesus loving his people. And the union between a husband and wife is meant to sort of reflect the union between Jesus and his people, which is a crazy, wild idea. But if you set aside all the craziness of Christianity, you're not left with this sort of perfectly coherent secular worldview that does all the things you need. You're left with nothing. The ground is crumbling under your feet. I like that example of the sort of cliff falling. I was talking with a guy at an airport just a few months ago, and I think he'd grown up in going to church, hadn't been to church in years, and I had the opportunity to explain the gospel to him, and using a little outline I like called 2 Ways to Live. I don't know if you probably have a different gospel outline you prefer, but it's just like
same gospel, different
same
outline.
Gospel, story of the Bible in six pictures, and the last one is like, okay, so now there are 2 ways to live. You can carry on keeping the crown on your own head instead of living with you as the Lord of your own life, or you can recognize Jesus' lordship. You can trust in his death in your place, and in which case you're forgiven by God and given eternal life with him. And I could tell at the end of our conversation, this guy thought that he was on the fence, that he was sort of on the line. I'd draw a line between those two options. And I had to say to him kind of lovingly, there is no fence. Like either you're with Jesus or you're not. And so to Molly's point, if you've come to the point of thinking, do you know what? I think there's more reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead than he didn't. Jump, because you're not sort of hovering in between two options. You're either currently facing God's judgment, or you have had all your sins washed away and wiped clean by Jesus' death in your place. Like there is no kind of mushy middle there. Like you're in one place.
A decision not to follow him as Lord is a decision to reject him as Lord.
Yeah.
One of the examples I use with Molly, and honestly, Rebecca, it was so junior high feeling that I thought she was going to outright reject it, but she's like, that actually really helps. Is I use this example of, I was like, imagine, you're out in a remote tribe that had never seen civilization, and there's a 747 on the runway. And you're telling this tribes person about this contraption that's going to fly. Standing next to him is a, MIT aeronautical engineer who can not only explain the principles of flight, could build the plane himself. And you give an invitation to both the tribesman and this engineer to get on the plane and fly to the destination. The tribesman, with all of his doubt and fear, feeling like this thing can't fly because he trusts you, gets on the plane with all of his doubts. The aeronautical engineer stands on the runway and doesn't get on. When the plane lands, who is it that made it to the destination? The one who knew all the answers, or the one who just? And the answer, of course, is the one who got on the plane. I'm like, that's what faith is to not get on Jesus, to not submit to him is a decision. I will not do that. It's at the end of the day, faith is a volitional choice to trust. Not being 100% convinced where you have no more doubts. It's what you choose to put your trust in.
I love that there's a Old Testament story of a prostitute called Rahab who was not among God's people. So this time, sort of the Israelites, the Jewish people who are God's people, and they were getting ready to actually conquer Rahab's city. And she sees two spies who've kind of come to scout out her city. And she, from what she's heard about the Lord, as in the God of these people, these Israelites, she recognizes, oh, that's the true, like that. What I've heard makes me think that this is in fact the God who made the universe. And therefore, I need to put my allegiance on that side, even though it's against my entire, my whole city, my whole sort of tribe, as it were. I want to be on that side when the moment comes, when the judgment comes, and I want my family to be with me in that as well. And this is amazing kind of act of faith that Rahab shows. And again, I love how she's using the New Testament as like this wonderful example of faith, because if you are a kind of self-righteously religious Jew, you might think, oh, well, a foreign prostitute is the last person I would want to hold up as a wonderful example of faith. But actually, that's exactly what the Bible does, of saying, be a Rahab. Recognize that your city is falling, and that the God revealed in Jesus Christ is actually the true God. And so
what a great example.
You need to be on his side. JD, I'm going to just ask you one more question about your books. I love the story that you told in the book about a woman, I think in your sort of geographic community, who had written a very negative critique of you and your church, but came to a different conclusion after more experience of your church. Do you want to tell us that little story?
We're not talking about you right now, right? I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Written any critiques of you, JD?
No. So there was a woman. She was actually from a different part of the United States. She had transferred in, like many people do, into our area to do some graduate work. And some friends of some people at our church invited her. Some friends of hers invited her to our church. I didn't know this girl at all. So let me start a parallel to this story now. I'm on, Twitter. I think it was called Twitter at that point. And I said something, just an affirmation of the sanctity of life in the womb, and an affirmation of life, which, I'm not ashamed about it. I felt like I needed to say something. Wasn't partisan, just, well, she sniped back at me. And all I actually remember, because I never Rebecca, I never respond on Twitter, because it's like just the cesspool. And so, I don't respond. I don't know what came over me. I did. I had no idea she was visiting our church. Her name was like Left Linda or something like that on our, and so, it's clear where she stood, and we went back and forth 4 or 5 times, and I forgot about it. That was the end of it. Well, a few months later, I get this picture at our church where she's sent me a picture and a letter, and in it, she said, it's a picture of her being baptized. And she said, hey, I was Left Linda who sniped at you that day. She said, some friends of mine invited me to this church. And when I first started to come, she said, I've learned very quickly that you really made me mad in some of the things that you believed morally and, that you believe the Bible taught. And she said, but, I kept coming because it was something that I was hearing in this truth about Jesus that attracted me, and I wanted that. Make a long story short, she says, I've come to faith in Christ. Here's a picture of me being baptized. She basically tells me that she's in the process of re-examining everything, because the Christian worldview affects every part of it. She said, and so I know that things are changing. She said, but what I want to say to you is I want to thank you that even though you said things that made me mad and I disagreed with, I want to thank you that even with that, you did not make this, the Summit Church, you did not make it the Republican Church. She said, because if that had been its reputation, she said, I never would have been able to bring myself to step in to here. Like I said earlier in our conversation, political realignment often happens when someone experiences the gospel. Everywhere the gospel's been preached, societal transformation has followed. But political realignment is the result of discipleship. It's not the gateway to it. And so, I would just say to maybe some of your listeners that are like, man, I can just tell, I can smell that maybe you and I are going to disagree on some political things. I'm like, fine, there's reasons I believe what I believe, but right now, at every point I don't represent anything because I'm distancing myself from a political candidate or a party. What I want to represent is a Jesus who stands above both parties, who critiques both parties and is preaching a different kingdom. To use the preacher line, we're not the people of the elephant or the donkey. We're the children of the lamb. And that's a different kingdom and a different message. And check him out, even where you disagree downstream. Let him convince you of whatever's downstream. To start with him and who he is.
Yeah. No, I love that. The Bible study that we have at our house a few weeks ago, I asked the room, and there were probably sort of 25 people in the room. I said, raise your hand if 5 years ago people would have looked to you and said, there is no way that he or she would become a Christian.
Wow.
And 7 people raised their hands. And this is something, you talk about sort of political realignment, this is something that we're seeing actually in the UK as well as the US. And the UK has recently gone through a sort of opposite political switch than the US, in that it's gone from a kind of conservative government to the equivalent of the Republicans to the Democrats. So
right.
What's happening at the moment is actually not just a kind of, oh, well, America is having this conservative resurgence and therefore people are going to church. No, it's actually it's far deeper than that. It's people who, across the political spectrum, actually have realized that a sort of making politics your God actually doesn't satisfy, and the individualization, the atomization, the loneliness that we have raised this last generation with, the sort of that Gen Z has been raised with, essentially, it is a really painful way to live. And that actually what we have in Christian community and hope in Jesus is what people's hearts are longing for. So it's been a joy and an encouragement to see kind of more and more people like that who are saying, gosh,
yeah,
I would never have thought, and nobody around me would have thought 5 years ago that I would have been a follower of Jesus now, but here I am.
Yeah. Or just think about this podcast here. You got me and you, right? You're, you got your background and all the, I don't know, I'm assuming your listeners, most of it know it, and you got me, a guy in the South who's a mega church pastor, and you got you, and I consider you one of my closest ministry friends. And I think you look at both of us 20 years ago and you're like, these are not likely friends. These are people that are going to kind of look side-eye at each other, but the gospel has a way of unifying and bringing together a people in a deep love and affection for each other, even when they start at very different places because of what they find in him.
I want to talk about joy just for a second, because I think probably one of the things that you and I do sort of naturally connect on is, and that I see in you, and I see in you especially, or not least when people around you, inside or outside the church, are criticizing you unfairly, just a lot of joy. So what's that about? Like, where does this joy and confidence, not in yourself, but in the Lord, with everything around you? I'm not saying everything around you crumbling. I didn't. That's true.
I know what you mean.
But where does the ability to say, okay, people might be saying all sorts of stuff about me. I don't actually need to spend my whole time worrying about that and defending every word that I've ever said, but instead I can just continue to do the work that God has given me with joy in my heart. Where does that come from?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that. Yeah, I mean, I have my moments, where there's like, it doesn't feel great, but there's there's a sense in which you begin to understand. First Peter, when he talks about ministry, he uses this phrase that just leapt off the page to me, talking about suffering unjustly. You were called to this. This is not like the unfortunate side effect of ministry. It's you were literally called to this kind of suffering. And I remember that. And I'm like, well, I'm not comparing myself to Jesus or the apostles, let's be clear. But I mean, that's what they experienced throughout that. And they maintained joy because it's how they fellowship with Jesus. It gave them a chance to rejoice in his victory. I mean, I get on this podcast, you're obviously, you and I are in a lot of alignment, but regardless of who I'm talking to, I'm like, man, I don't, no matter how this conversation goes, Jesus, his reign is sure, and I get to be united to him. I have this little thing on my shelf. Let me pull it off real quick here for you ever heard that it's the kintsugi? Can you see it? It's basically where they take a pot and they break it and then they put it back together with gold in the seams. There's been a lot of breaking in my life, and sometimes that breaking comes in the form of unjust criticism that nobody likes, especially when people are maligning your motives or make you twisting your words to say things you didn't say. And I'm like, Lord, this is not fair. Why am I'm suffering? I do enough dumb things. I should suffer for only those things. I shouldn't suffer for things I didn't do. And the Lord's like, right here, because what you do is I'm putting you back together with my presence, my gold in your seams. And that's the source of the Christian's joy, that gold right there, the gold of his presence. So rejoice, he says, in your sufferings, because that's a chance for you to know and love Jesus and rejoice in his resurrection.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I think there's just a profound confidence as well that comes from knowing that there's one human being who knows the absolute worst of you and who knows the absolute worst of me. And the things which, if anybody else knew that, the thoughts of our hearts and whatever, like anybody else would run away. And that one human being instead ran towards us with so much love that he was willing to die for us. So whatever anybody might say about you or about me, probably even if those things aren't true, worse things are true, right? Like in my heart and yours.
Yeah, you're wrong about that one, but here's some ones you didn't know about that you would be right about.
Exactly, and that if we have been forgiven, fully and forever forgiven, and not only forgiven but embraced and wanted and loved by the God of all the universe, then it's not that bad.
Yeah, not that bad.
JD, you just quoted from First Peter, one of Jesus's closest disciples, who had a major moral failure moment that's recorded in all of the Gospels, which I love that he made sure that was in there. And he says in his first letter that Christians should always be ready to give a reason for the hope that they have, but that they should do so with gentleness and respect. And I think that it in some ways is sort of like a theme verse for what you're describing in your book of Everyday Revolutionaries of Christians being ready every moment of the day to give a reason for the hope that we have in Jesus, and to do that with gentleness and respect. And so if you are not a Christian and you have Christians in your life who are acting towards you in ways that aren't gentle or respectful, or if you have Christians in your life who aren't showing the kind of love that Jesus calls every Christian to not only to their neighbor, but even to their enemy, and that includes their sort of ideological enemy, then maybe challenge them. Maybe challenge them to go back and read 1 Peter and then come back to you again with more gentleness and respect as they give the hope that they have in Jesus.
Yeah, good word.
Thanks, brother.